This tutorial will be a big picture overall kind of editing in Lightroom. This is not the end all be all. This is not the one and only way how to do things. There's a lot of different ways to work in Lightroom. I'm going to show you some of the things that I did for this specific photo. We're going to be covering a handful of different little panels here. So we'll talk about basics. We'll get into HSL coloring a little bit of color grading, as well as some masking in there. As the programs upgrade and change, some of the things will be altered a little bit. Even my computer now, I'm working on a Mac. A lot of you guys are going to be working on PCs and a little bit newer model or a little bit newer version of the software. So you'll have some things that I won't have, and that's perfectly fine. And actually, because my computer is probably a little bit more powerful, there's some things that I can do on my computer that you won't be able to do. Also want to mention to you that I'm kind of a little sick right now, and so my throat, I might be coughing a little bit here and there, so I apologize to begin with. So this is a photo that I used as an example for ugly spaces, pretty faces, or pretty shots. This is my daughter. We went to Home Depot. This is right after her birthday, and she got some binoculars. So they had a bunch of plants set up, and I just thought it'd be funny to make it look like she's doing a safari in the middle of the jungle. But reality, it's just a bunch of plants in the middle of the floor over at Home Depot. So in this photo, we went from this here to this. And so you can see there is a dramatic difference. I'm hitting backslash, forward slash technically. It's right above the return button to see the differences. There's a couple of other ways that you can actually look as well. So I can actually go on this one, so cycle between before and after. So I'm clicking on down here. I can see a bunch of different variations of the same thing essentially. And then I want to go back to the original. I click on the loop view. Cool. So because I already did my edit here, I don't want to completely undo it because I really like this one. But what I can do is I can actually right click, go to my little picture down at the bottom left of my library, and I can do a create virtual copy. So what you see is when I create a virtual copy, I end up with two of things. And then I just hit reset, and it brings me back to my original version of this photo. Some of the things that I want to do just to kind of start out with is to straighten it out. So I'm going to go up to the top right, and I'm going to go to my crop tool. Okay. In here, I can see a handful of different things, my aspect ratios. So I can go to my original. If I know that I'm going to print this at some point, and I want to get it ready specifically for a frame, I can do 8x10 or the 4x5. If I know that I'm like, hey, I'm going to use this in Instagram, I can do a 1x1, which is actually a square, right? So, and I can kind of see it in the top left over here as well of what that's going to look like. Sometimes I feel like that's a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to go with the shot, and I'm going to shrink it down. And so sometimes you guys get frustrated because you're like, why won't it? I just want to bring this side in. If we look over here, there's a lock, right? So if that's on, that it's going to keep that same ratio, right? So I'm going to unlock that, and I can move it around however I want. So let's go back to original. So I just want to keep it the same proportion. So I'm just going to shrink it down a little bit. And one thing I noticed too is that this is a little crooked. It's how she's holding it, not necessarily because they are crooked, but I can straighten that out a little bit, and it's going to feel a little bit more balanced. So what I'm going to do, I can go to the top right corner, bring that down a little bit, and I'm just going to kind of level it out. It's just going to make the picture feel a little bit straighter. Looks pretty good. Right around there. Okay. And I'm also kind of thinking rule of thirds as well. And so I'm going to make her land right on that intersection there. And I want to give her a bit of headspace as well. So she's, boom, just like that. So I can hit done, or I can hit return, and it'll bring us to that spot. I can also hit L to see what it's going to look like. and L is going to kind of black everything else out. I hit it again to go totally dark, and I'm back where I am. Cool. So I feel pretty good about that. Usually when I'm doing this, the first thing I'm going to do is that whatever is my main subject, I'm going to kind of do my color corrections based off of the main thing that I'm looking at. And so for this, I'm going to go off of her. I feel like it's a little bright, so I'm actually going to bring my exposure down a little bit. I'm going to play with my contrast. I think it's pretty good where it's at. Let's say I bring it too far. I can always bring it back to 0, or I can just double click on the word and it'll bring it back to where I want it to be. So highlights, pretty good with that. Bring my shadows down a little bit because I kind of like the contrast. Once again, I'm more worried about her right now than everything else that's happening, because what I can do later is I can mask it to make her pop a little bit in comparison to the background. And so I can make individual edits as well. But for right now, I'm just kind of doing big picture overall. Actually, one of the first things I usually do first is just my white balance. So on this, I'm going to bring it a little bit warmer. Once again, this is specifically for her. I'm not worried about the background right now because I know I'm later going to mask that out. And I'll talk more about that later. I'm going to I usually bring my blacks down just a little bit. Looks pretty good. And I can see here, like, her hands are starting to get a little pink. So a couple things I could do would be to make some adjustments in my HSL coloring. And so that stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. So hue is literally the color. So if I drag this around, you can see it's going to change those colors a little bit. So I'm going to bring it over just a smidge, the red over, so that way I can like soften that up a little bit. And I feel like it's pretty good. Now I actually bring that, go into saturation a little bit, or luminance. If I bring a little bit more white into that red, it's going to make that not stand out as much. And you're like, I don't see a difference. I can always turn this on and off, and you can see the difference there. So if you look at our hand, it goes from kind of pink to a little bit lighter. Once again, I can also hit my backslash. Oh, my backslash isn't going to work for this situation since it's a virtual copy. All right. So I feel pretty good about that. There's a lot of other options and other things down here that we could play around with. Like I said, I'm just going to show you information about this one specific photo, just to kind of give you a big picture idea of some of the things that I'm doing in this. So when I'm looking at this, I kind of want to get a little bit different vibe to it. I want it to feel like a little bit cooler, which you can kind of see here. So let's switch back to this one. Exposure down just a little bit still. And so I'm going to start getting into some of my masking stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to my mask, which is this picture here. And for me, one of the ways I can do it, and I can actually hit select subject, because I have a little bit faster computer than you guys have it there. What it'll do is actually literally select out my subject. It does a pretty good job most of the time. It's definitely not always perfect. You can kind of see here that my leaf is also selected. Anytime you have a situation like that, you can always hit subtract. So in this situation, I'll hit subtract brush. And I can use my scroll wheel to make my brush bigger and smaller. And that does a pretty good job, right? So right now, as I make adjustments to things, then if I want to add, I can just hit Alt. That's just the opposite of whatever my brush is. So I actually want to bring that jacket back in. Cool. So with this, if I adjust, right, it's going to adjust just her. But that's actually not what we want to do. I actually would want to do the opposite. Like I said, I'm going to show you a different way to do it as well, because I know on the school computers it doesn't work super well. So another good option would be to potentially do a radial gradient. So what I'm going to do here, and I think this actually works out really well for this because it also highlights some of the information in the background as well. So if we look at this, what we see here is that it is in the center here. This is 100% getting affected, where from here out, it's going from 100 to 0. I can adjust this with what is called my feather. So if I bring it to the right, you see it's less. If I go to the left, you can see it's a super hard edge. So I'm going to go pretty good, big size feather on here, right? But what I actually want to affect is all the information in the background, because I feel like I already kind of adjusted it to her. I'm pretty content with what she looks like. And so what I actually want to adjust is the information in the background. So I'm going to click on my 3 little dots here. I'm going to hit invert mask. So now it's affecting everything in the outside. I'm going to expand this a little bit. So I can see it's doing a lot of her. Maybe this make a little bit bigger as well. So I feel like I'm pretty content with that. Right now, everything that's in red is what's being affected. You can see here, everything that's white is being affected. So now what I can do is I can bring my exposure down all around her. And now she's starting to pop a little bit better. I'm also going to make this feel a little bit cooler. So I'm going to bring a little bit of blue into it. And that blue is going to also make her pop a little bit more too. Remember, the whole goal for this is to add to the photo rather than make it distracting. If I went too far with any of this stuff, right, too much, right? Your edit should be the first thing that we notice in a photo. So I feel pretty good about that. I might break it down a little bit more. And I can always adjust my edits too. So let's do a subtract brush, because actually I want to get rid of some more of this in her jacket. And I'm actually cool with how this looks down here. I think. Let's go. That's pretty good. Maybe add a little more blue now. So I feel pretty good about that. One of the things I can do too to create a little bit more depth is because right now this feels a little flat between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. I'm actually going to create another mask using a linear gradient. So what that does, same kind of concept, is that what's pink is what's going to be affected, and what's remains colorful is not going to be affected. And so I'm going to bring this down a little bit, and I'm actually going to go in and bring my exposure up a little bit, and I can play around with some of these things. And maybe because it's up in front, I might actually bump up my texture a little bit and my clarity a little bit. Once again, you can see, I can turn this on and off. It doesn't have a huge effect, but it's definitely an effect that happens. Right. So some of the things I'm going to also do in here is, is that I personally kind of like vignette look to it, but if I add vignette to it, you can see it really darkens things up a lot. It's like all over the place. And so instead of doing that everywhere, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to create a vignette more in the background. So I'm actually going to do create a mask, linear gradient, and pull down from here. And then that will also allow me to basically just bring my exposure down in those areas. And potentially might and then that kind of lightens up her head a little bit as well. Okay, cool. So I feel pretty good about that. Some of the things I still find to be a little bit frustrating in this is that on my right side here, I can definitely still see that it is part in the store, right? So what I can do, and this is where you're going to have a couple different options that I do. So I'm going to go to my spot removal tool, and I have clone, heal, and you guys actually have a tool called content aware fill, which is actually probably the best thing you could use for this situation. The cool thing about content aware fill is that it will basically take information from around it and fill it in with similar looking information. I don't have that option on mine because that's a newer option, but I can do either clone or heal. So I'm going to try doing heal and see what that looks like. So I'm going to draw over basically a bunch of the information that I want to cover. And it's going to look around and try to find something that's similar. And that's pretty good. So I'm going to hit that. I'm going to fill in some of this stuff. See if you can find a spot that looks pretty good. And I can pull from over here, which is totally fine. See if I can get under her arm a little bit without too much issue. That looks good. Pull from over here again. And overall, I think that definitely looks better than it did. So we can turn that on. So that's off. And that's on, right? Off, on, right? So you can see it definitely makes a difference. I forgot to do that for our masks too. So if we turn our masks on and off, you can see from here to here, it makes a massive difference. You can definitely tell that we have a little bit of a halo here, but I feel like it's one of those, if you didn't really, if you were just looking at it, it wouldn't really bug you too much. We could potentially bring that in a little bit to make that adjustment by bringing our radial gradient in just a little bit further. Bring our fade in a little bit more too, so you won't see it as much. It's kind of neat, like as you move it around, you can kind of see how it changes a little bit. Kind of go back how it was. Cool. So I feel pretty good about that. Overall, pretty content. And so one of the last things I usually do is I personally really like color grading. That's not something that everybody has to do. It's just something that I personally really enjoy. So what color grading does, it's a way to kind of adjust your highlights, shadows, and your midtones to kind of tint them in a little bit different of a color. For this situation, I am going to bring my shadows a little bit more blue, right? So you can see so this changes the color as I rotate it around. The farther out I pull, the more intense that is, right? So if I go really far out, you can see as I go around, it totally changes it. So I'm going to go pretty good, kind of up there. I'm going to bring my midtones probably a little warm. So like my oranges or yellows. Once again, it's the little things that make a difference, right? So I'll write it from here to here. It makes a difference. And then my highlights. You see, as I drag this around, it changes it. The further out I go, the more intense it is. Maybe you don't like it like that, and that's totally fine as well. I forgot, one of the last things that kind of bugged me about this picture was the reflection. I felt like it's actually a little bit distracting. And so the way I kind of got rid of it in the other photo was to go back into my masks, and then let's zoom in. If I hold on spacebar, you can see I can drag stuff around. It works really well. So what I'm going to do is actually create a circle for both of these. So I'm going to hit create new mask, radial gradient. I'm going to basically just get into that space. So I feel pretty good about that. In here, I can just hit add, radial gradient again, do the same thing. And this way it's doing both of them at the same time, which is kind of nice. Cool. And then I'm going to bring my exposure down, or I can actually bring my blacks. And you can see it still ends up getting this kind of weird like coloring to it. An easy way to deal with that is actually just desaturate it. So I bring my saturation down. I could also make them a little bit bigger if I needed to. And also change it so it's not, so my feather is not as intense too. So I'm bring my saturation up a little bit so there's a little color in it. Let's zoom back up and see what it looks like. It's a little intense. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is sometimes when you feel like your subject, and then one of the last things I'm going to do is to essentially create a darks and a lights mask. So sometimes our images can kind of feel flat, especially if we took them on our phones. Like I said, mine's a iPhone X, so it's pretty old actually at this point. And doesn't always have the best image quality. So some of the things I can do to kind of bump up that depth a little bit is to create a dark and a light mask. So I'm going to add a new mask. I'm going to do a brush. This is something I'm pretty bad at remembering to do, is to label my brushes. And so I'll start doing that in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go in here and look at some of where some of my shadows are, and where I kind of want to enhance some of those shadows. So I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit up to 100. And I'm going to look at like her neck in this space. And you don't have to be like, oops, I went too far on her chin. If I hit Alt, remember you can see that turn into a minus. I can clean that up pretty quickly. So I'm pretty cool with that. So let's adjust my feather on that. Okay. So here. So pretty cool with that. Add a little more shadow in this space. Under here a little bit. Use Alt to clean that up. Add a little more shadow in this space. Let's see. Jacket in here. You can see it's okay if it goes over a little bit, it's not the end of the world. So I'm actually going to go a little on this side too, outsides. Actually on her hands too. Right. Cool. So what we can do, let's go back and zoom out. So you can kind of see some of those spaces. I'm going to go in here too. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my exposure down a little bit. Potentially my blacks a little bit. Maybe a little shadow. Let's feel pretty about that. So let's turn that on and off. Alright, you can see a difference right away. Once again, it's the little things that make a difference. If you're like, oh man, that's too intense, Nelson, I can go into my amount on any of these things, and I can bring that up and down. So I go up less and go the other direction and do more. So I feel pretty good about that. And then, so I'm going to relabel it by clicking on it twice. I'm going to call these shadows or darks. Okay. And then, depending on the situation, I'll also do a light. So basically the same concept, except now I'm doing highlights of things. Once again, it just creates a little bit more depth on this stuff. So that's pretty good. Maybe we'll add that. We'll add there. And these are just like my brightest spots. I feel pretty good about the rest of it, honestly. Cool. Alright, so let's go back to fit. And then I can bring my exposure up a little bit. Potentially my whites. Pull my shadows out a little bit. Because it's just an easy way to create a little bit more depth to things. We're at fit again. I'm going to hit L so we can see the picture by itself. It's a little intense overall. I could potentially bring my saturation down on everything. Well, overall, I'm pretty content. I'm pretty happy with it. So I'm going to hit L to get out of here. Done. Go down to my saturation. I think just bring my saturation down just a little bit. Yep, I feel pretty good with that. Like I said, this is the one I did before. Maybe. Right, side by side, you can see they're a little different, but they're also pretty close to. Kind of have a similar vibe to it. So, yeah, hopefully you picked up a thing or two in here. This is not everything that you can do with Lightroom. This is just what I did for this photo, and hopefully this can kind of show you how much of a massive difference it makes to do your edits, and it's worth your time to do it. Before, after. Alright, so now you should be getting in and doing some of your edits on your own photos.